We're going to focus on the more practical side of the delivery of Triple P, and we've already heard some terrific ideas about how to customise and tailor Triple P to the needs of families that you're dealing with. And I think we should just reiterate why it's important to have a mandate to do this. What we're dealing with is families in many contexts where they're presenting with quite complex problems. The problems that you might be seeing on a day-to-day basis don't always match the kind of families that were involved in the trials, where certain levels of Triple P might have been trialled and tested. They will be similar and different in a number of different ways. But for an evidence-based set of practices to really hum and to speak to the community needs of parents out there, these practices do need to be able to be tailored in appropriate ways. And so what we have is a kind of a creative tension in some ways, because it's a tension about being flexible, being creative, being able to adapt a program on the one hand, but still to follow the fundamental principles and the core content of an evidence-based set of practices that have been put to careful evaluation over many years. And so it creates a little bit of a dilemma, and the issue is, how is the dilemma resolved? When I was mentioning the issue of complexity, I think it's important to remind ourselves that we're not talking within Triple P of a single intervention. And so the whole issue of what intervention delivered through which delivery modality is effective for whom is a pretty important kind of question in its own right. So we can think of universal offerings like a seminar series or potentially group Triple P, to the more intensive tailored variants of Triple P, for example, enhanced or pathways, and that in itself is different from a multi-level system implementation of all levels of an intervention system. And with the variations that are already built into the design of the program, of being able to deliver it face-to-face, over the phone, in a group, individually, or as a web-based or completely self-directed intervention, that's a level of flexibility that you don't have to invent, because it's already part of the design of the system. When we think about the kinds of children and parents and families that are being served, you've got a kind of complex mix in some ways of children who themselves, biologically and genetically, in terms of their family history, will vary in terms of the type and severity of difficulties that those kids are going to have. And parenting is a very important part of the causal chain for some of these behavioural difficulties, but there are other causal factors that will be driving the degree to which the parent is experiencing behavioural and emotional problems with their children. For example, poor parenting doesn't cause autism, but we know raising a child on the spectrum is going to be creating some very different challenges for parents of typically developing children. At the same time, we're working with parents who, in terms of their own histories, their own kind of mental health status will vary. So within a group, you could have a group of parents who are normal in terms of their level of stress, which may well be very high, but it's still in the normal range of, say, parents of preschool kids. Two or three preschool youngsters is a pretty stressful task for anyone to take under the optimal conditions of partner support and that kind of thing. But there will be other parents in the group who come with a history. They come with a history of their own mental health difficulties, family of origin experiences, and so on. Some will be families in transition who've experienced major traumas in other environments and be new immigrants to Australia. Others will have really been thrust back into the parenting role because they've had to step up to be a custodial grandparent because the child's own parent is not capable of looking after the child. And so when we think about the different faces, the different ways in which you can have complexity, you can have all of these things happening in the same family, or you could have just one or a subset of them. And then when we think about the delivery setting, the whole system is designed so it can be flexibly delivered in many different ways, through childcare centres, through public libraries, through schools, through health centres, through private clinicians' practices, through community-based services that are being delivered. And it's deliberately designed in that way so that differences in the resources and capacities of communities can be taken into account in how a parenting support strategy is put together locally. When we started Triple P, there wasn't any evidence-based intervention that you could deliver a parenting program like Triple P to rural and remote families using technology. And I mean, the technology that we used when we first started doing this work was the telephone. But we were able to demonstrate the delivery of a level 4 standard intervention with a self-help workbook with phone calls was producing comparable results to an 8-session group program and a 10-session face-to-face individual program delivered over the medium of the phone. So what that's created in some ways is a design process where quite a bit of creative energy has already gone into framing the interventions. Remember when the history of this field is essentially you've had single modalities. Particular programs have been developed like PCIT or Parent Management Training, Oregon, Jerry Patterson's work that focused on individual delivery and a treatment model basically for aggressive and conduct problem children. Or a Carolyn Webster Stratton's program with Incredible Years targeting a group-based delivery for early onset conduct problems, but generally kids with clinically elevated behavioural problems. It's moved towards a more prevention model in recent times. But there hadn't been a parenting intervention that even sought to try to think of flexible engagement with multiple providers with different levels of intensity that could be offered to a community. And so what you're dealing with within the design of the Triple P system is already a fair amount of flexible engagement potential that stems from having a system designed in that way. Now, in thinking about responding to the needs of families, it's always helpful to keep in mind some of the most basic fundamental principles that inform this intervention. And the one that's the most important is this notion of self-regulatory capability. What you're trying to do is to create a parent who's relatively independent and autonomous in making the parenting decisions they need to make on a moment-to-moment basis. And our job is to get the parent from their current level of self-regulatory capability, which might be quite limited, to a much higher level of independence and autonomy. And so when we think about creative engagement and delivery of Triple P, it's always important to keep these self-regulation principles in mind because they provide tools to enable you to accomplish this. Remember, self-regulation, the 4 key parts of it are self-management, the tools of personal change, self-efficacy, your belief in your capacity to do the tasks of parenthood, so that's a cognitive construct. Personal agency has to do with your attributions, how you explain change, how you explain your child getting better or worse. And we know that when parents attribute change in their children to something other than their own efforts, you've got a fragile linkage. For example, the parent who says to you, thank you, you were so helpful to me, it was wonderful doing this course, is telling you something about how they explain the improvement. They're grateful because you have helped their child. And so whenever you hear that, you should be thinking, yes, well, look, thank you for that. It's nice to get a warm fuzzy, isn't it? You know, when someone tells you you've done a great job. But what is it that you have been able to do that's enabled you to accomplish this? Enabled you to accomplish this because you haven't done the parenting. They've done it. They've been responsible, but they attribute their effort to you or to something beyond their own personal control. And so when we think about this notion of moving towards parents becoming more self-sufficient, what it means is that after they've done Triple P, they should be better able to handle similar problems in the future with the same child, similar problems with a sibling in the future or concurrently, so that they're learning their skills in a way that enables them to transfer or generalise the learning. And that over time is going to lead to a significantly reduced support. Now, it's interesting when we heard the presentation earlier on about the parents who didn't want the group to end. Now, one of the things we need to be just mindful of that is that most Triple P groups are transitional events in people's lives. They don't lead to permanent friendships being created. These are actually quite fragile social groups. And when you get a situation where parents are wanting to connect and to continue, you've got to ask yourself, well, what is the role of the practitioner in continuing to scaffold that? Is it better to allow natural group processes and friendships and so on that may have formed just survive to the extent that they're going to, rather than seeing the group structure as being necessary for the future health and well-being or the maintenance of the skills that the parent has already learned. The experience of most parenting programs that run group programs is that the friendships created tend not to last. There are some kind of mothers groups, for example, post-birth kind of, mothers groups that get together that are often created that can sustain, and early friendships. And my daughter's 35 now and she's got 2 kids, and their kind of mothers group that they had established around child health, they're still meeting on a regular basis for wine and whatever. But parenting groups tend not to do that. Now, I want to just return for a moment to why the self-regulation piece of Triple P is so important. First of all, self-regulation is associated with many different positive outcomes for both kids and adults. Academic achievement, lifetime income, savings behaviour, physical and mental health, better interpersonal relationships, and global greater sense of personal well-being and happiness. Deficits in self-regulation are found in many psychological problems, including anxiety, depression, aggression, criminal behaviour, and impulse control problems such as binge eating and alcohol abuse. It appears that this mechanism of enhanced self-efficacy and sense of personal capability seems to be a common psychological mechanism that is taking place in a number of other effective therapies, not just Triple P. And it's this mobilisation of I can do this, this is something that's within my grasp, I have the skills and knowledge and capability to tackle what's ahead of me. And as I mentioned in the talk this morning, deficits in self-control in kids as assessed as very young children, as 3-year-olds, can predict long-term outcomes. Now, sometimes it's worth thinking about, well, if we were successful, what does a self-regulated parent look like? If you actually acquired these capabilities, what is the concept of self-regulation? And I've tried to give an operational definition so that you can see what it is that we're aiming to accomplish. Now, a parent who is pretty self-regulated would generally have a clear sense of the sorts of behaviours, skills and values she or he wishes to manifest in herself as a parent and as an adult, to instill in her child and to foster in her home and the broader community. In other words, this is a parent who's got a clear sense of what life's about, what kind of values and skills and behaviours they think are important. They would have realistic expectations of themselves and others in a caring role with their child. So they wouldn't be entitled or demanding, expecting the earth from someone else who's looking after their child. They would have knowledge as to what she could reasonably expect of her child at different points of his or her development. So they'd have reasonable expectations of what kids are capable of doing, not too high, not too low. And believe me, there are many parents who can have expectations that are far too low of their children. This is not uncommon in parents of children with a disability, for example. We refer to it as the Nurturance Trap. The assumption, because the child has a disability, they can't learn to independently toilet themselves. And so the parent doesn't try to do toilet training. They attribute the child's deficits in self-care to the disability. It's a lifelong handicap for a person who's capable of, with a good toileting program, to become independent in toileting, to be an adult who is still wearing diapers and so on. The parent would monitor their own behaviour against the standards that they are setting for themselves, but it would be an automatic process. It's not something that is going to be conscious or highly deliberate or extremely reflective, because you don't want parents to be spectatoring their own parenting performance so that, in a sense, they're anxiously checking themselves all the time. That's a formula for anxiety and obsessional behaviour. So most of the monitoring that you're doing is at an unconscious level. It just simply smoothly operates, but then occasionally you'll detect a discrepancy between what you want or the personal standards you're aiming for, which might be to speak to your children civilly, to not lose your temper with them. And you find you're confronted with a current behaviour of your own or your child that is where you're yelling, you're screaming at them, and a self-regulated parent would detect that discrepancy, and then what that would do is that would initiate goal-relevant behaviour. That means that the parent would start thinking about, okay, I'm doing something that I don't want to be doing, and I need to get into a problem-solving mode here to get myself out of this. So they volitionally will bring unconscious, relaxed parenting under conscious control and say, right, I've got to sort this. Now, by deliberately attending to these behaviours, they would provide information from which the parent develops ideas about what they can do and develop some objectives around it. It might be a little parenting plan around not shouting again, or following through more consistently, or using a behaviour chart that I've started but doing it properly this time, not one day off, one day on, and that sort of thing. The parent would draw on their own knowledge and skills when formulating the options and developing a plan. It might mean going back to your Triple P workbook. But most of the parenting that's going to be done after Triple P is not with the aids of a prompt, a video, a tip sheet, or any reminders. These will become habitual patterns of behaviour that may need, if they've been slippage, for the parent to go back one step to establish some more reminders or develop a little plan. Now, these would include parenting and interpersonal skills that they may need to use to bring a problem under control, and personal management skills of just little verbal reminders. They might do a reminder note to themselves, or some strategy that would make the desired behaviour that they're trying to do again more obvious to them, or it would be top of mind again. The parent would execute the plan, evaluate its outcome, and if it's not working, revise it and keep going until they've got a solution. But they would not simply go back to the old destructive behaviour patterns that were leading to the problems in the first place. They would pick themselves up early to be able to tackle the problem effectively. And at this point, the parent would then allow the new behaviours that they've, with a plan, to become automatic again. So it's not this kind of planned, conscious kind of process. It just becomes more automatic. The parent would have positive expectations that they could enact their plan. In other words, if you ask them, how confident are you that you can do this? The parent would be saying, yep, I know what I'm doing. I can do this. She would be reflective, open to and capable of identifying personal strengths and weaknesses, successes and failures without beating up on herself. So it's someone who's able to take a kind of, like, it's almost like pushing the pause button on life. You think about it in a video, playing a video, you just put the pause button on and now you're reflecting on what's just happened, what's been going on. And that these self-evaluations would be generally constructive and lead to positive actions. The parent would be capable of managing kind of their emotions that go along with trying to deal with any other goals that they may have for their children, for work, in other words, they would be able to be juggling some competing demands. And she would mostly find this an enjoyable process, not a stressful, overwhelming, demanding process. Having genuinely high self-regulatory capacity, she'd have the ability to deploy her self-regulation skills when required, and to suspend them when they're not required. In other words, it's sort of like a set of problem-solving behaviours. You flick on when they're needed, you turn off when they're not required. And this would be all done pretty automatically, when it turns into a sort of a conscious, deliberate kind of process, the parent would be very aware of what she's trying to accomplish. And on occasion she'd let go of her kind of higher order beliefs and thoughts about what she was trying to do and live for the moment. There would be that living in the present, enjoying your children in a way that makes you highly attuned to the moment and to enjoying the experience of parenting. Now, if you think about that kind of as a sort of an end game that Triple P is aiming to accomplish with people, it's a pretty kind of healthy, relaxed, normal way of parenting, but the parent has now got tools. The toolkit that they require when they've decided they need to act to solve a problem, boy, can they kick in and know what to do. So when we start to think about some of the targets for this self-regulatory process, and we think about what it is that both Triple P is aiming to do and why it's aiming to do this, the self-management piece is about the parent deciding what goals they're shooting for with their child and themselves. It's not what Triple P says the goals are, it's what parents themselves define as what it is they're seeking to accomplish. And that's a very big difference. And what it means is that it doesn't need to be preachy, moralistic. It doesn't need to be, kind of raving on about anything being absolutely a wonderful skill or strategy. The respectful assumption is that parents have got a brain and will make informed decisions that are in the best interests of themselves and their children. Things that we can do in helping parents become more self-efficacious, that is, believing in their capacity to do something that they want to do. The best predictor of future performance is past behaviour. So when a person has acquired a skill, that is what builds self-efficacy in your belief that you can do it in the future or do it again. But if you haven't got the skill, sometimes people can be confident that they can do something, but they don't have a skill base for thinking that they can do it. Once they've actually learned a skill, the self-efficacy really means something. Okay, let me just jump ahead here. I'd just like to reiterate something about the process of the toolkits that we have as practitioners to promote these self-regulatory processes in parents. It seems that a collaborative relationship in working with parents is very, very important. It's about conveying respect for the person that we're working with or the group that we're working with in an emotionally supportive context. So there's no place in doing Triple P for being critical of parents or putting them down or having a joke at their expense when it's kind of humiliating or belittling, even though it might get a laugh from the rest of the group. It's about working with the parents in a way that builds a sense of future, builds a sense of optimism, and optimism specifically in their capacity to do what it is they have to do. If you're able to convey to the parent a kind of a belief in the parent's capacity to rise to the occasion, deal with the issue that's in front of them, even though it's highly distressing, it's sometimes overwhelming for the parent, you're doing them a huge favour. Sometimes real expertise in working with families is about actually letting go of control, because remember, there's nothing more there's no greater trap than to feel this great sense of personal accomplishment when a parent asks you a difficult question and you provide them with a good answer. It's a different level of skill to know the answer, to not immediately share it, but enable either the group or that parent to derive the solution to the question that they've already asked. And remember, the importance of doing that is that this may simply be another example of what they've already covered previously. And so they've already got the content, they've got the knowledge, they don't have the linkage. So it might be when a parent says to you, yeah, but how do you deal with the kids when they're fighting in the car? And you've already been through and planned activities, training, taking children shopping, another high-risk situation. It might well be that the prompt, which would say, remember the example that we gave last week about taking kids shopping? What were the key essence of that strategy? Now, how might that be applied to the back seat of the car or travelling in the bus? Where you're prompting the parent to search for the answer, to derive a plan and to share it back with the group. Now, in some ways, the skill, your skill professionally, is not in giving them the answer, but it's providing them with the scaffolding to enable them to come up with the answer themselves. It's much quicker to give the answer, but it doesn't create the same level of memorability for the parent to be able to take the solution away and act upon it when you're not there. Particularly if you become, or we inadvertently create what we might describe as a prompt-dependent learner. This is someone who learns in doing their experience with Triple P that all I have to do is ask someone else and I'll be told what it is that I need to do. So what do I do when that happens? Now, what about that? But what about this? And if that doesn't work, what about that? And you can work with parents who, there are no end to the number of these questions that might be thrown your way if you reinforce them every time with a good quality answer. You know, and the thing is that if you know your stuff inside out, you can answer these easily. You know sort of kind of the routines and how to apply them and so on, but that's not the point. It's about what the parent is taking away from the session with you and what they're prepared to commit to and act upon. Avoiding reinforcing self-defeating behaviour on the part of the parent would include examples of saying, oh, look, I can't do this, it's just really hard, my husband won't help me with this, and then we're ending up thinking, oh, you poor thing, isn't that awful for you? And you get into this kind of sympathy/empathy mode, and what you start to notice is that the parent, over time, gives you more and more examples of why life sucks and how difficult it is. And then this great kind of trap we get ourselves into of the big ear therapy. Of course, it minimises resistance because you're not trying to teach or explain or demonstrate. And so when all you're doing is listening, summarising, reflecting, clarifying, and the parent is becoming more and more skilled at complaining and then embellishing the complaining and amplifying it further, unless it turns into commitment to action, to doing something about it differently, we'll stay there. We'll stay in that kind of place where the parent feels supported, but gee, they're prompt dependent. And they're nowhere near being self-regulatory in the way in which they approach their the challenges with their children. So they're much more likely to come running back to us or need further help when they may have been able to stand on their own 2 feet. Okay, so I'll just navigate through some of these points, because there's another example here about providing what's referred to in Triple P as the minimally sufficient level of intervention. A lot of problems you encounter in the delivery of Triple P can be resolved by remembering two key concepts: self-regulation and the minimally sufficient intervention. What's the just enough that enables a person to do what it is they need to do and get on with it? And so it's not about thinking that to be successful with Triple P, you're offering an 8-session program for, say, running group, and then feeling absolutely devastated because, you know, 3/4 of your group haven't made it to 6 sessions. It's what have they been able to demonstrate about their learning along the way that would be an indicator that they've reached a threshold of, you know, being a responder to the intervention or having derived benefit, or you can obviously see the skills that they've learned. And sometimes the issue is not the question of how much extra support do we need to provide to people, but how little support might be required to enable them to do what it is they need to do. And so in Triple P, we're great sort of fans of this idea of just enough, no more, and this kind of notion of elegant simplicity of an intervention. Sometimes when we're confronted with complex problems, the great tendency is to think complex solutions are required, when in fact, you know, if you think about the sort of family that I'm thinking of, where the marital problems, the mother's depressed, the kids have got reading difficulties, you know, behavioural problems, there's 4 kids, they're all out of control, you know, no one wants to babysit them, there's financial problems, and it goes on and on and on, and the list is can become a very long one. The thought that in order to assist this family, we've got to hit all of those risk factors, we've got to hit them all potentially concurrently, maybe sequentially. The thing is that most parents burn out with intervention fatigue. They can't actually access all this support anyway. And so there's a little kind of idea of the light at the end of the tunnel. If you can get a breakthrough, just think about an exhausted, overwhelmed, miserably depressed, sleep-deprived parent of a toddler who finally gets that toddler into a decent sleep routine and has a decent night's sleep. How different the world can look the next day. And so, you know, sometimes these breakthroughs with behaviour change can create a sense of much greater kind of cascading positive benefits within the family system. Okay, now I want to talk just momentarily about the issue of self-regulation now from a child's perspective. Because we've talked about the self-regulatory process in terms of encouraging adults to be independent and autonomous. You will have noticed, no doubt, in the design of Triple P and the skills that we're teaching the parents, it's also about teaching children to do things for themselves. And so an example would be here is the self-regulation capability promoted in this example would be doing homework independently. The strategy is incidental teaching. The parent-child interaction situation is when a 7-year-old child asks for help, the parent pays attention and prompts the child to solve the problem for themselves, giving a clue without giving the answer. And the illustration here is, Mum, how do you spell necessary? The mother says, well, how do you think you spell it? Have a try yourself. You've got the beginning right. What about that ending? Is it E-R-Y or is it A-R-Y? Well done. So it's this scaffolding prompt that enables the child to find the solution. The example that I sometimes give is a child trying to get a lid off a container. The child says, Mum, can you help me with this? The mother says, show me what you're doing. Try twisting it the other way to see if the lid comes off. Well done, you've done it yourself. Versus, Mum, can you help me with this? Bring it here. Thanks, Mum. Very different outcome, isn't it? One outcome is the child independently having solved the problem themselves. The latter one is their job is to be thankful for someone else having fixed their problem. Well, if that's the way you parent your kids, that's what you're going to teach children to do. Rely on you to sort out all their little problems for them. Another example of a self-regulation skill being promoted in parents would be this independent brushing of the teeth using ask, say, do. Now, the great thing about Ask, Say, Do, I mean, we used to call it forward chaining, you know, teaching a behaviour in a forward fashion, breaking it down into logical sort of steps, get rid of the jargon. Fundamentally, the interaction is, what's the first thing you do when you brush your teeth? I don't know. Well, you get your toothpaste, you squeeze some toothpaste on the brush like this. Can you do that? No, I can't do that. And then the mother, having trouble, are you? Squeeze the paste here using manual guidance prompting, loads the toothbrush with the toothpaste, the child brushes their teeth. They end that interaction with a win. The child has completed the task. And what you've got, a child is learning to independently brush their teeth with the least degree of prompt that they need to do it on their own. And if the first prompt doesn't work, the parent escalates to manual guidance and showing the child what to do. Okay, the other example of a self-regulation skill with children is just children monitoring their own behaviour or tracking their own behaviour. The strategy would be to prompt the child to review or reflect on their own performance or achievement or what they've just done. The parent-child interaction situation is that the parent asks the child to review and report on how they've been going with the practice of a skill or behaviour. And the parent might have said something like, okay, now how many stickers have you got on your chart now? Or tell me what you've done to get all those stickers. Not, aren't you fantastic? Isn't it great you've earned all of those stickers for doing as you've been told. So what the child is learning to do is to track and report back on their own behaviour. And so if we're trying to build a sense of self-reflection of children's own accomplishment and reduced reliance on external praise and adult support, then prompt the child to identify and tell you about the things that they've just accomplished without boasting or skiting. And you see, in the context of that without boasting or skiting, they're learning to give feedback to themselves, but in a way that doesn't court social rejection. And you're teaching them a way to talk about their accomplishments without having to be seen as being, you know, a smart ass or someone who's really, skiting or showing off. Now, one other example to do with regulation of emotion. The positive attending, this is the strategy, positive attending to a child's attempts to regulate their own emotion, to deal with a difficult situation. The parent-child interaction situation is that the parent provides positive attention following a child showing restraint after being provoked by a sibling. On the video it goes, the other sibling going like this, and the child gets up off the bed and walks away. The mother then comes up and comments on how pleased she was that, James, I really liked it the way you ignored Aaron just then when he was teasing you. And so here's an example of the child not fighting back, not getting into a sibling squabble, but managing that emotion and just taking the audience away from the older kid, the mother paying attention to that and acknowledging the skillfulness of the way in which the child dealt with that situation. Now, what I think we're illustrating is something that's really very fundamental. Every parenting skill that you teach in Triple P has a child reciprocal skill that's on the receiving end of it. So, for example, when you're teaching descriptive praise, what is a child learning to do with that praise? To accept the praise, to accept it without being silly or without, going or showing off to their brother or something like that because they've got attention. So they're learning to accept it appropriately, and sometimes kids will be able to say, "Oh, thanks, Mum." So acknowledging the praise. So that if we think about just another example. The child who is, where a parent is using incidental teaching, what skill is the child practicing when the parent is using incidental teaching to prompt them? Problem solving, yeah. So the child is practicing the problem solving skill. When we talk about parents talking to children and having conversations with kids, what are the skills that the children are learning? Listening, looking at, asking an interested question about what the adult has just shared with them. So think about it, even a behaviour chart is like a bank book. It's like, if you think about the life skills of, adding up your bank balance, or reading a printout statement from a bank account, all of this involves numbers. It involves being able to add things up, look at columns to see how well you're doing in terms of a saving target or something like this. Timeout, I often think, is best way of describing this is an opportunity for children to self-regulate emotion, to calm themselves down, to just get over it. Build a bridge, get over it. And the more we get involved in, holding up that bridge and talking to the child while they're in an upset state to try to get them to calm down, the greater the risk we're creating a prompt-dependent learner who becomes very good at calming down so long as you're there. Trevor Mazzucchelli and I wrote a paper in Clinical Psychology Research and Practice published in 2010, which tried to argue that good evidence-based practices should enable practitioners who've got basic command of the content. I like the way Bruce was saying previously, the importance of knowing your stuff. And when you know the procedures, the strategies inside out, you're in a much better space to be able to know what to vary, what to speed up, what to slow down, what to emphasise, what to not need to emphasise as much because you know they've already got it. But when we think about this notion of what is a high risk and a low risk variation to the content of the program or to the process of delivery, we've tried to define in this article examples of these high and low risk things. So we've already heard some of these today. More sessions, longer sessions. The idea of having still the same content being covered, but having a little bit more flexibility about whether you do it as once a week for 8 weeks, or you do a weekend workshop 2 days, or over 2 consecutive weekends where you've got 4-hour Saturday morning blocks. Think creatively about that, because the bottom line is that if they've got the content, if they've got the opportunity to practice, is the key. You can nail this in a day, but they'll have no opportunity to practice and learn from it, and to learn from their mistakes and to get feedback. Having school contact. School contact is needed when children have difficulties at school, particularly if there are complaints about the child, or you need a parallel process operating in a classroom management program. We'll get onto that in a minute. Switching to a briefer version. I mean, if you're starting on an 8-session program and you're finding that the parents has basically made many changes up to session 4, and they're really, the question for a lot of practitioners is, what's the magic number that they need to have had in order to be a responder to the intervention? Most of the studies we've looked at is that you're getting a good clinical response with 4 sessions. You're getting a better one with 8, but if you get the threshold of 4, they're often a responder. So if you get less than 4 and they exit before they've had the proper coverage of the disciplinary routines and strategies, then it'll be a much less successful outcome. High risk intervention, high risk processes would be to specifically advise a parent, you need to do this or not to do that. The way we look at it is, it's not your choice. The parent is crafting a solution. You can provide tips, suggestions and guidance, not prescriptions. And then it's often seen as something that's very gentle in the way in which you teach, and highly respectful of the parent's capacity to make a good decision. Really high risk process things are like having no agenda, being all chaotic, having no structure, jumping things around too much. Look, there's one thing to vary the order of things on the basis of your on-the-spot decision that doing it in a different order might be appropriate. But parents don't tend to like jumpiness when they've got in front of them the content of what it is they're going to be covering, and you're jumping all around it. If you tell them you're going to just vary the order slightly, then that's fine. You gain a mandate for doing what you're about to do. If you just landed on them, you can lead to some confusion sometimes. Repeatedly abandoning agendas to deal with the current crises that have cropped up in someone's life over the course of the week means you often don't get through the content. Always being trapped into providing answers. Giving feedback about what they should and shouldn't do without proper explanation. That would be quite hazardous. And then content variations that we would see no problem with is modifying examples. For example, one of the things that we found in our father focus groups and the survey work with fathers is that fathers actually find the whole issue of dealing with children's emotions particularly challenging and interesting to them. And so we did a survey of what would you like to have covered in the content, and one of the top two items was issues to do with kids' self-esteem and also dealing with children's fears and anxieties. And not knowing how to deal with kids when they're upset and they're crying or saying, "I'm scared of this, Daddy." You know, whereas mothers, that was much lower on the list of issues that they saw as being important to cover. Modifying a step in a tip sheet so that it corresponds to what the parent is going to be implementing. Those sort of things are not a problem. Changing a focus from dealing with the content of a group session to dealing with an issue of, say, teamwork, partner support, backing each other up, where you're spending a bit more time on that because you've run into a roadblock, basically because two parents in the group are in disagreement about how they move forward. So you may have to deal with that issue. What would be a big no-no and not be considered a creative use of Triple P would be to go through the parents' workbook, and we've had this happen in Canada, and every single mention of the word quiet time and timeout has been blacked out. It's like the Russian newspapers, you know, or the Chinese newspapers, where the censorship of content was something that this person liked Triple P, but couldn't stand the use of timeout. And it's interesting, you know, when people form these opinions about what's appropriate, what's effective, that sometimes this is the absolute intrusion of personal values and beliefs against a scientific knowledge about what works, and not only that, is of what's socially normative in the community. We found from population surveys about 75% of parents in Australia use some variant of quiet time or timeout. They're not necessarily using it effectively, but they know about it. So to try to pretend that it doesn't exist and we're never going to talk about it, even if you're dealing with a child for whom there is a contraindication for using the strategy. For example, a child who's being put in timeout, who's got sort of self-injury and repetitious behaviour that would just provide them with an opportunity to practice that behaviour. That would be a bit of a contraindication for those kids, but it doesn't mean that same skill is not relevant for other siblings in the family who perhaps don't have that problem. So the other thing that I'd be careful about is trying to blend things. You know, there's a great temptation to say, look, can't we just do Triple P, but every session we're going to do have a moment of prayer, or we're going to have a moment of sort of introspection and reflection and sort of mindfulness parenting right at this moment. And you say, okay, well, you know, that's a possibility, but when you're doing that, you're not doing Triple P. Okay, and it's got to be made clear to parents that this is not part of Triple P. Because the thing that I tell you can happen, and this will happen more and more once we activate the consumer voice, and that is that if the public, the parenting community, really knows that we are listening and that there is a valuing of parenting that gets to the point that is similar to parents' views on what they consider a good school to be. We know parents will fight cats and dogs to get their kids into a good school, move to an area that they think is a good school. We dish up a lot of rubbish to parenting. to parents in parenting programs. Once the consumer voice is mobilised, it will mean that parents will start asking difficult questions. Training, standards, what's the evidence to support this practice? And they won't take it from us that, believe me, I'm the expert, this is good for you. Lots of people I work with love it. You'll love it too. And so that kind of plea to people's kind of sentiments and experience, and just take it from me, I'm a knowledgeable, experienced person, won't wash in the future. We're going to see consumer sites that'll be like Choice Magazine evaluations of parenting programs. There'll be websites set up where the parents can go and have a look and feel for what an intervention's like from the perspective of a participating parent. What are you going to be asked to do? Have you ever thought how little parents know about what's on offer when they're asked to do a parenting program? Most of it is on the basis of, the best predictor of doing triple P, knowing someone who's done it. And that's probably because the someone who's done it can tell them what it's like and what they're asked to do. And it was, it was difficult in the first session. I was a bit embarrassed to talk about it, but then we had to do this and it was really good. And so that once we start taking seriously the need to educate and inform the consumer, parent as consumer, to what it is they're being asked to invest their time in, what we will start to see is an increase in not only demand, but expectation. So let me give you an illustration. You've got a practitioner who's delivering group triple P. This happened to me. A parent rings up from South Brisbane and she said, we're all very informal there. She said, "Is that you, Matt?" I didn't know her from a bar of soap, but I said, "Yeah, hi, it's Matt Sanders." She said, "I want to tell you something." And I said, "Oh, what's going on?" "I've been attending a triple P program at our local school, and we've just got to session 4. It's been really great up to now, but our practitioner said we're not going to bother with the phone calls." And she said, "But on page 76 it says we'll have 3 phone calls. Do you know about this?" And I was thinking, oh my God, the fidelity police are here, and But what the point was is that you had a consumer concerned enough about, she wanted the real thing. She wanted the whole program. She wanted the best outcome for her child. She'd read about this program, and so once you start mucking too much around with it and changing it too much, we can create a problem with the consumers who've been led to believe they were doing triple P or being required to do it. So we just need to be a little bit careful about that. In the guise of being creative and flexible, let's never forget the fundamental core content still needs to be there. Okay. I would just like to, at this point, get you to reflect that just as we just pause at this stage, just thinking about this notion of flexibility, tailoring, creative application of the triple P intervention, what we've got working for us. First of all, triple P works best when it is delivered with fidelity. There was some interesting data presented from the San Francisco Parent Training Institute at the most recently conducted Helping Families Change conference, which incidentally is in Sydney next year, February I think it's 17th to 19th. This is the international triple P conference that travels the world. It only comes back here, every 5 years or so. This coming year, it's in Sydney. It's a must go to. It's a fantastic conference. There's some really great presenters and workshops and programs, and it'll be right here in your city. But basically, she presented data at this conference in LA, basically demonstrating that in practitioners who are delivering standard and group triple P at a level 4 level, those practitioners who delivered it with the highest fidelity, in other words, pretty much like it's supposed to be delivered, had significantly better clinical outcomes than families who delivered it who received a low fidelity implementation of the program. And it was particularly marked the differences for immigrant families, for Hispanic and African American families. They were much more likely to do better, in fact 4 times more likely to complete the program if it had been done with fidelity. So we've been talking about cultural diversity today a lot, which is fantastic. These data we're sort of supporting that not only the idea that we need to flexibly tailor, but we need to do it with fidelity still in mind to get the good outcomes.